Pastor Sonia here. I'm so excited to bring you this next message in our series of 40. Last week we found the Israelites right on the edge of this amazing land that God had promised them. And yet they found themselves listening to the wrong voice rather than trusting the voice of God. And so we find the Israelites now wandering in the wilderness for the next 40 years. You know, the Israelites had seen so many miracles. How is it that a people who had seen God's hand at work find themselves in this place where they no longer trust Him? They saw God's hand through the 10 plagues in Egypt as God tried to turn Pharaoh's heart towards him. Even in the midst of those 10 plagues, the Israelites' families and their crops and everything that belonged to them were not touched by these plagues. And even when finally Pharaoh allowed them to leave, God did more miracles. Pharaoh had changed his mind and was pursuing them in the wilderness, trying to drag them back into slavery. Israel finds themselves right at the edge of the Red Sea with nowhere to go. God does an amazing miracle. He parts the sea, and the Israelites walk right through with the water on both sides. Even as they exit that water, God once again does another miracle, and He closes the waters back in on their enemies that were trying to bring them back into slavery. Time and time again, there are so many miracles that God did in their midst, and yet we find the Israelites still struggling to trust God. Why is this? What we're going to talk about today is how to make room for God. You see, the Israelites in their slavery went through some of the most harsh conditions. In Exodus chapter 1, verse 14, it tells us that they made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. You see, for hundreds of years, the Israelites were not free. They weren't free to worship. They weren't free to do what they wanted to do. They were under someone else's oppression and rule. And when the time came that God gave them that freedom, can you imagine what that may have felt like for them? They had been born into slavery. Every decision of their life would have been made for them. When they would go to work, when they would come home, who they could spend time with, and whether they could worship their God together. And here they are for the first time. They're experiencing that freedom. They have free choice. They can think their mind. They can pursue God. They can choose not to pursue God. And we find in this moment that even though they have all of the time in the world, they've not made room in their hearts to develop this relationship with God. You know, when I was pregnant with my first daughter, I had this thought in my mind that I was so excited about the maternity leave. And so in the weeks leading up to the time when my little girl was going to be born, I had opened up this notebook and I made this list. And I had this brilliant idea that maternity leave would be like a vacation, and all of the things that I never had time to do because of work and other commitments, that now I would have time to do them. Boy, was I wrong. By the end of my maternity leave, I opened that notebook back up, and of course, as you expect, nothing was done on that list. Now, part of that may have been my own naivety, but I think part of it was that I had never made time for those things in my life to begin with. You see, we can't expect in seasons of wilderness or silence that we'll make time for the things that we never made time for before. You know, sometimes we expect if only those distractions, whether it be work or children or school or whatever it is that keeps us busy and stressed, that if those things would be removed, that we would be closer to God. You know, this season in the world, probably the entire globe has more free time than we ever have in our lifetime. If you can imagine, people all over the world that used to commute, take buses, take cars, many of them are working from home. So many of the recreation activities that we've enjoyed because of COVID have been closed. People in most countries can't even go to church and worship in person. And those that do, there's many activities that they can't do anymore. So there's no clubs, there's no birthday parties, there's no special events to go to. We all have this leisure time that we never had before. Now here's the question for you. What have you done in this season with that time? And I believe the same as with the Israelites. They find themselves for the first time having all the time in the world, and yet they do not have the type of relationship with God that they wanted to. You see, it's in the desert of our lives that we have the choice to run to God or run from God. And so when we choose to run from God, we actually will find idols of distraction, things that will put in the place of God to fill the voids that only God was meant to fill. You see, each of us have this place in our hearts that only God was meant to fulfill and to bring joy and to bring peace. And in the midst of busyness of life, sometimes we don't even know that we have that need. And I think that's been our life pre-pandemic. Many of us were so busy just carrying on with life that we didn't realize that we had this need for God. And yet we see in the story of the Israelites, when Moses is going up the mountain of Mount Sinai to bring them the word of God, the 10 Commandments, he tells the Israelites to wait for him and he's going to return soon. And yet all panic breaks out after a few days when Moses does not return. And so rather than waiting for Moses and trusting in God, yet again they turn their hearts from God. And it says that they even crafted an idol. You know, nowadays we don't craft golden idols or calves. Now there's some cultures that do, but the majority of us, that's not what an idol will look like in our life. For many of us, idols are idols of distraction. They might be addictions or coping mechanisms. They're things that keep us from pursuing the right things in our life. And so the God who created us, you know, he has made us to be people that need God. And so in this season, if you are not pursuing God, I would challenge you is what are you filling your life with? Often we find, and we are hearing all these reports of the rise in alcoholism and drug addiction and gaming addiction and pornography, and we're hearing cases of domestic abuse and violence, and people's lives are falling apart. And why is that? When the busyness has been removed, when we have been unenslaved from the busyness of life, and yet we see so much brokenness in the lives of people around us. I believe that's because the destruction caused by these idols are ripping families and homes and people apart. And there's so much brokenness in the midst of society because we are a people that need our Creator. And so I want to encourage you, just like the Israelites, God has an amazing plan for you. And as we are in this season of silence and season of really in a wilderness, to pursue God and to know that He loves you and He has amazing plans for you. And so I want to encourage you to not run from God, but to run to God and open your heart to everything that He has for you.